Before theology is ever taught from a textbook, it is often already embedded in art. Before a child can define Christology, before a seminarian can explain empire, before a preacher can name coloniality, many of us have already learned something about God through images. We learn from the paintings on church walls. We learn from the pictures in children's books. We learn from statues, stained glass, classroom illustrations, icons, crosses, book covers, and devotional objects. We learn who looks holy. We learn who looks innocent. We learn who gets centered. We learn who is imagined as close to God. And sometimes, without anyone saying it out loud, we learn who is treated as background, foreigner, dangerous, sinful, or in need of saving. That is why art matters for post-colonial theology. Post-colonial theology asks how Christianity is being shaped by colonial power and how Christian faith can be reclaimed. It asks how Christian mission, doctrine, biblical interpretation, worship, and visual culture have sometimes carried the assumptions of colonizers rather than the liberating witness of Jesus. In this presentation, I am focusing on art because colonial Christianity did not only travel through sermons and doctrine, but also through images. And if empire helped train the Christian imagination through images, then post-colonial Christians, witness, must also learn how to see differently. Here in the chapel, there are images of Mary and Jesus that appear white or racially ambiguous in ways that still lean towards European sacred imagery. Then there is also the Black Madonna, Mary with the Black Christ child. That contrast, it matters because the Black Madonna interrupts the assumption that divine tenderness must be imagined through whiteness. She reminds us that Mary and Jesus do not belong to European imagination alone. They belong to the whole church. But even her presence raises a question. Why is this kind of image still so rare? Why does it stand out so much? Post-colonial theology helps us notice what we have been trained to treat as normal. White sacred art often gets to be just Christian art, but Black sacred art often is treated as contextual, cultural, political, or special. That difference reveals power. The question is not only what color was Jesus? The deeper question is, who has been allowed to picture God and whose image of God has been treated as universal? When I look at the images on doors, statues, figurines, and common church objects, I see how often Jesus is made white. There may be an occasional Black representation, like this small Black Jesus figurine, but the larger visual pattern is still clear. Whiteness has often been treated as the default face of Christ. And this is not harmless because images are not neutral. They form memory, they form devotion, and they form theology. A white Last Supper, a white crucifix, a white Good Shepherd, a white baby Jesus repeated over and over again can quietly teach that holiness looks white, leadership looks white, innocence looks white, and salvation comes clothed in European flesh. That is visual theology. When I search Jesus art, the pattern continues. Image after image shows Jesus with pale skin, European features, soft brown or blonde hair, and a visual language shaped more by Western Christian tradition than by the historical reality of a first century Jewish man living under Roman occupation in Palestine. This is where post-colonial theology becomes important. Thinkers like R.S. Sugatharja have helped show how biblical interpretation itself has been shaped by colonial habits. Kwok Puilan has pressed the church to consider how Anglican and Christian traditions are formed through global power, culture, and empire. Musa Dube's post-colonial feminist interpretation reminds us to ask how scripture, mission, gender, and domination become entangled. Robert Heaney's work helps frame post-colonial theology as a way of seeking God and one another in the midst of histories marked by hate, domination, and division. Together, these thinkers help us ask, what happens when Christianity is preached through the imagination of empire? The issue is not simply that white Jesus is historically inaccurate. The issue is that white Jesus can function as a visual theology of empire. He can make European culture look universal. He can make colonized people look secondary. He can make whiteness appear innocent. He can make the conquered feel as though God looks like the conqueror. And when that happens, Christian witness is compromised. Because the church may think it is witnessing to Christ, while actually it is witnessing to an image of Christ shaped by colonial power. Even when I search for historically accurate Jesus art, white Jesus still appears again and again. There are more brown, Middle Eastern, and historically grounded depictions, but the dominance of whiteness does not disappear easily. That tells us something. Colonial imagination does not vanish just because we add better information. It has to be confirmed. It has to be unlearned. It has to be replaced with truer, fuller, more accountable ways of seeing. Post-colonial theology does not ask Christians to abandon Jesus. It asks us to disentangle Jesus from empire. Jesus was not born at the center of imperial power. Jesus was born among an occupied people. Jesus lived under the pressure of empire. Jesus was executed by the state. Jesus' body was publicly humiliated. Jesus' resurrection was not the victory of empire. It was God's interruption of empire. So when Christian art repeatedly detached Jesus from occupation, brownness, suffering, land, poverty, and state violence, it risks making Jesus safer for the very powers that crucified him. Post-colonial theology calls the church back to a more dangerous and truthful memory. It asks us to remember that the gospel is not good news because it conquers. It is good news because it liberates, heals, restores, and tells the truth about power. How do we bring about a revolution of the heart? For me, that is also a post-colonial question because post-colonial theology is not only intellectual, it's spiritual. It's imaginative. It's about conversion, not conversion into empire's religion, but conversion away from domination, away from supremacy, away from the false innocence that refuses to see harm. A revolution of the heart requires a revolution of sight. Here in my own work, I am trying to imagine sacred presence beyond the limits of colonial Christian art. Here, the figure is marked by trans colors, blood, resurrection, the cross, the lynching tree, the slaughtered lamb, the ancestral presence. The body is not explained away. The wounds are not erased. The sacred appears in body that empire, racism, transphobia, and religious violence might try to discard. This is not only representation, it is theological resistance. It asks how we can recognize Christ where respectability told us not to look. In this painting, body and earth are connected. Blood moves through the map, water, trees, and the money. Post-colonial theology reminds us that colonialism was never only about ideas. It was also about land, labor, extraction, sexuality, motherhood, borders, wealth, and bodies. The bleeding world makes visible what empire often hides. This image holds memory, water, spirit, and formation. It comes from a world where faith is not only written in books, but carried in bodies, songs, prayers, baptisms, mothers, church girls, and sacred imagination. Post-colonial theology makes room for these locations as real theological sources. This final image centers Black womanhood, multiplicity, ancestry, and light. The halo does not erase her Blackness, it illuminates it. And this is what I believe post-colonial Christian witness requires. Not simply adding diverse images to the same old theology, but allowing the image itself to challenge what the church thinks holiness looks like. Post-colonial theology matters because Christianity still lives in the afterlife of empire. That afterlife is visible in doctrine, mission, institutions, and art. If colonial art helped train Christians to mistake empire for God, then post-colonial theology invites us to see again. As a next step, I would invite viewers to read Robert Heaney, Kwakpui Lan, R.S. Surgatharaja, Musa Dubé, and Wan Hee Anjo. These thinkers help us not only ask what Christianity has said, but who's been allowed to speak, and who's been allowed to picture God, and what kind of Christian witness becomes possible after empire.